let businesses know that ESG is not a cost. ESG is an investment, and it's an investment in the future of your business. If you want it to be financially sustainable, you have to build in resilience, and you have to build in these different systems that are going to function in harmony within the ever-shifting business landscape. And the way that Pueo does that in our consulting company, we do it through biomimetic processes and systems analysis of the way that natural environments function.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Clean Techies, the podcast. This is episode 46. Today we are kicking off our ESG Mini-Series with a discussion about ESG from kind of an introductory and philosophical standpoint with Ryan Kemp. Ryan has really actually very interesting background prior to his consulting work, where he's traveled around the world to post-colonial countries and been able to see firsthand a lot of the issues kind of faced in these communities and how business currently impacts them, especially the overseas businesses. And we start with an introduction to each part of ESG. Then we got into some of the nuances, including discussions around fair wages, disconnectedness from supply chain, education, and ESG, just generally speaking, a lot of other things as well. Generally, I did feel this was a much more philosophical discussion than we usually get into. And I think, to be honest, that's exactly what I really do enjoy and why I enjoyed this episode so much. So I really hope you do as well. Before we get into the show, we definitely want to make thanks for our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change, definitely worth reaching out to NextWave. You can do that a few different ways. One is by reaching out at next-wavepartners.com. Otherwise, you can reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And again, really great people over at NextWave. Definitely recommend reaching out to them if you are in those spaces. But without any further ado, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Ryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm calling in from beautiful Oaxaca, Mexico. So I'm feeling sun-kissed after being at the ocean and feeling really good. How are you doing today?
I'm great. It's definitely not as nice in New York City as it is in Mexico, probably, but still, it was a great day today. So really excited for this conversation. Really do appreciate you joining today. I think what makes sense probably most is let's just start with kind of having you give an introduction to yourself and what you're doing.
Sure. How far back do you want me to take it? Because I think context is often pretty important to help people to understand how we arrive at certain places or why we're motivated to do certain things.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to understand, in addition to what you're doing, kind of how you ended up into this space and, how you came on this journey.
Okay. Yeah. So I've kind of had a long meandering journey that is still continuing, but ultimately I can say that it really kind of launched off when I was about a junior at university at Northeastern University in Boston. I was studying finance and history, and I decided to kind of push all of my classes internationally. And the first school that I discovered that had some classes that I wanted to join, which was Chinese philosophy and international finance, was in Hong Kong. So when I was 20 years old, I moved to Hong Kong and got my first taste of the international business scene and learning different philosophies and just really having my mind expanded about what is culture and in general, different ways of being and different worldviews and ways of living. And from that point forward, I continued to travel and I pushed all of my classes to Spain the next year, in Valencia in the south of Spain. And after that, when I was 22, my first official job was moving to a farming village in Cameroon, close to the border of Nigeria, called Bali Nyonga, working to cut down on food spoilage, which was hovering at around 50 to 60% in these farming confederations. And moving from Boston, Massachusetts, as a 22-year-old to Central Africa was probably the biggest shift that I had experienced to date. And it completely shattered my worldview and where I wanted to allocate my energy. So I'd say that within that was kind of the birth of this seed of wanting to utilize my skills and education and energy to do something that is benefiting people and the planet and other beings that are on the planet, whether it be animals, plants, whatever you want to call it. All of this is factored into what is authentically sustainability, which is the understanding of merging our civilization with nature. So from that point in Cameroon up until now, I traveled the world for about 11 years, working and living with different indigenous groups from Australia to Africa, to the Caribbean, Central America, and the Hawaiian Islands. And I was doing grassroots development work that was looking to merge regenerative business models with traditional business models to essentially enhance and infuse life at the center of every action throughout the stakeholder chain of a business. And that is basically what Pueo Consulting does, which is my regenerative business consulting company that maximizes organizational value through regeneration and future-proofs companies in this uncertain time that we're in, with climate change, with things like the pandemic happening, with a lot of other issues that don't need to be named, but there's plenty of things that are kind of shifting the business landscape, and to become regenerative has been the solution that I've found, has been able to maximize the value that an organization can bring, as well as to extend its longevity. So that's some more context on how I've ended up here today.
Yeah, I think that's quite helpful. It's a very, very interesting journey. So I would venture to make a few assumptions that probably you have pretty deep ties and understanding of the S part of ESG. But I guess before we get into that, for people who are maybe less familiar, could you give us just kind of a brief overview of what does ESG mean? What are the basic principles of each pillar?
Sure. Yeah, ESG stands for E is environmental, S is social, and G is governance. So when we look at that as a unit, the environmental criteria often includes energy a company takes in and the waste that it discharges, the resources that it needs, the consequences for other living beings as a result of these processes. So oftentimes companies look to do things around carbon emissions, but it's also oftentimes around water and waste, and how a company utilizes its resources and is then affected by the environment. S, social. So that's really about relationships within the company, the reputation that it has with the brand, the people and the well-being of the people, and then the institutions and the communities where the company does business. So that includes diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really how a company functions in society with human beings. And G, governance, is essentially the systems or the practices and the controls that companies adopt in order to govern themselves, hopefully towards advancing and enhancing E and S. But that really is like things around macro regulation, complying with other needs of external stakeholders, and any other sort of like legal creations that require extra governance. But really, as a functional term, ESG traditionally would be an inextricable part of how businesses are functioning. However, we've kind of bifurcated and compartmentalized business, where we've forgotten that businesses are proponents of the well-being of the planet, as opposed to strictly based upon the economic system that we have right now of extraction. So this is like relearning or remembering what it means to be an actual citizen of the global environment as a corporate business. So it's my little brief ESG.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite helpful. I guess what I'd like to do next maybe is go into, I think E is relatively straightforward and pretty well covered in a lot of discussions these days, but I think with your experience, it'd be really helpful to maybe break down the S aspect, the social aspect a bit more. Could you maybe talk about what are, maybe some of the initial things that companies, if they're looking to kind of implement the S aspect of ESG, what will they do initially? What are some of the kind of various things that they should look into? And maybe we can talk about too, kind of what the benefits of that are beyond simply doing what's right.
Yeah, there's a lot of different layers and dimensions to how to approach this, but I think I'll start from the top, or the most superficial layer of it, which we can call impact topics. Basically, obviously, your workers, or what is often called human capital, which is a very strange term in my mind. But how can you improve workers' lives would be one of an example of the S. So that could be dealing with the actual hourly or salaried pay, the use of contracted labor, things around wages, things around the freedom that you're allowing workers with vacation. It could be different compensation policies and practices and what's being integrated with the actual reward system with your employees. It also then moves into specifically kind of employee training and development and purpose. So I think that purpose is something that's really emerging as what's really directly important with the S, right? As we see this massive exodus of employees from different businesses and this massive uptick in employees who are doing work remotely, it seems very clear that what's happening is that corporate missions and values are really diverging from employee values and what they see and want to create in the world, and how do we actually usher in purpose and impact into the corporate culture to begin to allow employees to step into and feel that what they're doing really matters on a day-to-day basis. So I would call that value stewardship. And how can you actually usher in more purpose and value stewardship throughout the business so that it can appeal to and actually continue the employee's natural growth cycle and evolution in the business itself. So there's things that can move from the superficiality, which is like the actual policies that go into setting the container through systems of how you can benefit the social aspects of ESG. But then simultaneously, there's a lot of things that you can kind of trickle down to the deepest core of like what is a human purpose on this planet, and how can you cultivate creativity, and how can you cultivate actual true connection and motivation within that employee to benefit the business. And simultaneously within that, people are going to be more productive naturally, because you're more productive when you have more energy, and what brings you more energy is doing something that you like to do. So the S in that social can kind of span a lot of different facets, but that would be that'd be a couple different ways that it does it. And I mean, at least for the way that quantitatively we look to measure the ways that the S benefits companies, is you can look at enhanced productivity with employees. You can look at lower employee attrition rates. You can look at advanced recruitment options for companies if they're actually able to tweak their mission and values to appeal to Gen Z or other generations that have a larger desire to have more impact and to have their profits motivated by purpose as opposed to the other way around. Enhance brand reputation around the actual way that the company is positioning itself. I mean, there's just kind of endless ways to tie this back to the bottom line, but the social is obviously, I would say, one of the most important. I mean, directly, I mean, they all feed into themselves, right? I mean, governance is the system to then structure in the way that the social environment can give back to the environment. So it's really just how we can tie these all back to let businesses know that ESG is not a cost. ESG is an investment, and it's an investment in the future of your business. If you want it to be financially sustainable, you have to build in resilience, and you have to build in these different systems that are going to function in harmony within the ever-shifting business landscape. And the way that Pueo does that in our consulting company, we do it through biomimetic processes and systems analysis of the way that natural environments function. And we combine that with different indigenous traditions and understandings that are looking to merge business and nature, or society and nature, as opposed to viewing them as two things at odds with one another.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So there's a lot of things there. I guess I'd be keen to go a little bit deeper into some of the aspects with supply chain issues and ensuring, correct social practices especially among third world countries and supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about that and how companies should be looking at their supply chain to ensure correct social practices in that area?
Yeah, so I'd like to start just by sharing the way that I feel about the word or the phrase third world. I mean, even that phrase in itself is kind of emotionally charged with some sort of hierarchical stance of how things are. The way that I've been phrasing that recently is post-colonialist. So these countries in which resources have been immensely extracted with a manipulation of value to then create a juxtaposition of wealth on the economy of scale that we've accumulated in the weird cultures, which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Essentially, the way that we've structured this is by not really imbuing the supply chain and the entire stakeholder chain with the advancement of life at every single node of what's taking place. So for me, if you navigate through the supply chain, you have to navigate back to the roots, or what we call resources in our current economic language. What is actually being taken from the planet that is creating value for us and utility for us on the far downstream end of the consumer. So you have to start by understanding first what exactly your product is and knowing the exact direction that it takes from the supply chain. So to make this a little bit more honed in, I'll give an example, right? Like let's say that your product is chocolate. Let's say that your company is selling chocolate bars, and you want to find out how you can implement ESG throughout your entire stakeholder chain to bring life more to the center of every action in that. So the first thing you would do is go back to exactly where is the cacao being taken from, or harvested, or farmed, whatever word we want to say, right? So the first question that I would ask is, are farmers being paid a fair wage, A, but B, is the soil being cultivated and treated in a way that is destroying it, or is it actually benefiting the soil and creating more life within it by strengthening the microbiome and by actually utilizing permaculture and regenerative land use practices to make sure that you're not just going to farm that land for cacao for 20 years and then that land is completely dead for the remainder of time. So I would start at the very beginning like that, in that way, to then begin to move and see, all right, well, how are we treating the people who are farming it, growing it, and the land itself, which is providing the nutrients for it? So starting at that level, you then start to move downstream, where let's say the next stage after looking at the farmers and the land is the packaging. So what is the actual packaging that they're using? Is the packaging something that is plastic? Is it contributing to enhanced waste in these different post-colonialist countries where the manufacturing or the actual packaging process is happening? And then you can kind of continue down the line from there, looking at every single node of where the product moves before it ends up in the consumer's hands. So that includes shipping, that includes the actual logistics and transportation to get it to brick and mortar storefronts, or if it's digital, then it's in a warehouse somewhere. And then it extends back all the way to the consumer. And is the consumer aware of the transparency throughout that entire chain, where they can then make an educated decision on the purchasing of that specific product versus another one, with information at hand about how the businesses are treating every single thing throughout the entire supply chain. And transparency is key in regeneration. And that's also somehow a little bit frightening for a lot of businesses. And it's understandable, because a lot of what we've done in business is behind closed doors. But really what's happening now is that consumer demand, with the shifting awareness that's unfolding, especially post-pandemic, people are a little bit more involved with what they're wanting to consume, with the awareness, especially with various different reports coming out, where we probably have less than a couple of years, I think, from the latest report that came out around climate change to actually get our act together. So it's a really important thing for businesses to understand, because there will be no business or an economy with the ever shifting changes related to climate. So it's how can we literally step into this today and do it in a way that's going to keep our business afloat and actually generate more revenue ad infinitum into this process that the business takes place in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. I really appreciate your thoughts there, and that's interesting to hear the way you look at it. I think I'd be curious to understand, your perspective on it's kind of a combination of things here. So let me see if I can frame it correctly. Is how can we get stakeholders, at various levels, right? There's obviously investors and executives and everything. How can we get stakeholders at various levels to essentially practice restraint in a way where it's not about, okay, how much can we get out of it, but how can we make what's reasonable for us, but also help redistribute essentially more of these earnings from these products all the way throughout the supply chain, not even just to the employees of the end production company, but all the way back to kind of the source where it's coming from. And again, with that, taking the long view of ensuring, well, actually, not even super long anymore, taking the long view of ensuring resiliency and sustainability within the land, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, and you're kind of getting into more of the in-depth work that we do at Pueo, which is actual behavioral change and value system change. Because really, what's happening is if you look at the way that the economy functions, it functions on supply and demand, right? So this is like one of the principles that I think it was Paul Samuelson. I'm not positive on the name. He was an MIT teacher, and he kind of like popularized the supply and demand model with GDP. But really, how supply and demand functions, it functions on the continued extraction of a resource until there's none left, because that simultaneously increases the price, right? So like the more demand there is due to the decreased supply, that's beneficial for the economy. So the entire supply and demand functionality is inherently profiting off of a extraction and distinguishment of the natural environment to increase price. So within that value system itself, we've now created a massive juxtaposition of wealth, which is why the 99 versus the 1%, right? I mean, that's literally the biggest juxtaposition that you could have of wealth. So within that structure, throughout a lot of my travels and studies, I've actually learned that the system that we're functioning in, call it economics, but it's actually called chromatistics, and it's a process of the accumulation of wealth, versus economics in itself is a system traditionally that would provide sustenance for all of the people involved in it. And it comes from the Greek word oikos nomos, which means household management. So if we're thinking about economics and how are we managing the resources of our home, you don't manage them, if this is all of our shared home, you don't manage them by hoarding all of your resources in one direction. So because that has been a value system conditioned and imprinted into the way that we do business and the way that we often consume more than we need, it really stems from a deep shift in the value system and behavioral change that can actually have people feel a little bit more comfortable with, instead of their business making 200x on what the natural resource or the product itself is making, how do you be fine with 150x? Because like really, even within that 50x, you can completely transform industries, you can completely transform countries within that. And I think that there's organizations starting to do this sort of work, like 1% for the planet, for example. But I mean, is that really a fair market share when we get 100% of our resources and business from planet Earth, and then we give 1% back? So there's a lot of ways that we can kind of dive into this. And one of the things that Pueo does is we give 10% of all of our revenues back to indigenous groups supporting the reconciliation of language and the revitalization of culture, because the cultures of these groups is what actually maintains the worldview of interconnectedness and the way that all of these systems can be in harmony with one another, as opposed to the value system that's really centered on massive extraction and the juxtaposition of wealth. So I think that, long story short, to answer your question, I think that a lot of this work in ESG, or what Pueo calls regeneration, is how do we actually begin to step into a deeper understanding of a natural value system, or one that's coherent with nature, as opposed to an economic culture, which is what we're kind of steeped in now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is interesting. I just finished reading the Principles of Dealing with a Changing World by Ray Dalio. And I guess I'm curious to hear if you have perspective on how, given the history of, I guess, nations and power and everything, the rise and fall of all kinds of nations, how do you think that this could hypothetically translate into creating essentially a peaceful world where people are restrained in what they take, and kind of have some level of quote unquote trust in their neighbors that, maybe there won't be a bad actor, or how will this play out geopolitically, just generally, if you have any thoughts on that?
That's a tough question. I think I can't really address that from a geopolitical stance. But all I can say is that I can speak in kind of smaller scale metaphors that can be used on an interpersonal level to see how our actual actions day to day could contribute to a more of a collective movement. And so, for example, food waste is a major issue in the United States. I don't know how many tons of food get thrown out annually. Too many, probably 800 tons. I mean, probably way more than that. I don't even know the number, so I'm not going to even attempt to make it up. But one of the issues that I see with food waste, for example, is how many of us as United States citizens have ever grown our own food? The answer is probably staggeringly low, right? So there's a inherent dissonance and correlation between the lack of people growing their own food and food waste itself. So because we're disconnected from all of these processes that keep us alive, we continually take without understanding what the production needs to be for us in order to consume. So because we're strictly operating on a consumptive versus a productive basis, we have forgotten the effort and the work that it takes to actually, for example, grow your own tomato. And when you grow your own tomato, you're not going to throw away 3/4 of a tomato that's on your plate, because you're going to be like, wow, that took 3 months of me in the sun, watering that, digging it, planting it, caring for it like a child, for me to then actually consume that tomato. So just by interconnecting or building the awareness of the experiential process of the production of our goods and services is going to inherently build in more gratitude and build in more understanding of how much extra we are taking now that we don't need. So I think if you can extrapolate that out to a global level, there's a lot of people who unfortunately might produce every single thing that they do. So for example, to bring the cacao example back in, right? Like I lived in Ghana and Cameroon and a couple other places that grew a lot of cacao. And you would meet farmers where they had never even seen a bar of chocolate, yet they are on the farms, tilling the soil, hot in the sun, growing the cacao, and then selling the cacao to the cacao board in the country. And then it gets shipped off and made into Hershey's cacao. They'd never even seen a Hershey's bar. So they were steeped in the production, but they didn't know about the consumption, right? So like there's these kind of like dissonant models that are occurring that are affecting the ways that we understand the entirety of the process. And I view that as compartmentalization, and a lot of it is systemic oppression. And for the geopolitical world or the global world at scale to do this, I think that there have to be multiple different levers that come into enact to fill in the interconnective gaps that are missing in those particular environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is interesting. The conversation could go in a different direction. I think we'll steer away from that, but just generally, I'm quite interested in the supply chain aspects of ensuring localized supply. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, so I did grow some of my own food growing up through my mom teaching me these things. But I think you're right. There's a lot of people who are not familiar with that, and kind of there's a disconnectedness that's an extreme example and probably too often happening, right? So it's a very interesting example you bring up. Appreciate that. I'd like to maybe shift over into the G aspect of ESG, kind of going back to the company and corporate level. What really does implementing the governance aspect within a company look like? What are some of kind of the initial actions they can take that are concrete, that can help them kind of advance their their mission here?
Yeah, so governance, I want to pause for a second. I'm really glad that you've experienced growing your own food, because it's one of the most important and nourishing things that we can do as human beings. And Wisconsin has a lot of good food, including some good cheese curds. I know they're pretty well known up there.
Yes, they need to squeak in order to be good.
Exactly. Yeah, they're always squeaking. I remember that. So to get into the governance standpoint, I mean, really the governance is the container upon which life can either flourish or life can kind of degenerate. So within governance, a lot of it can start at the top with mission and engagement. Normally, a lot of this is coming spurned from like the C-suite, with different levels of impact focus and companies' approaches to creating a positive impact. So that can go into things like the mission statement characteristics, the social and environmental decision-making. For example, how does company integrate in social and environmental performance into the actual decision-making? Does it factor it into compensation? Does it factor it into manager roles with job descriptions that explicitly incorporate these sort of things in the performance? Is there any advisory board positions that hold stakeholder representation? What sort of KPI measurements and metrics do companies have set? And it really can just trickle down all the way within these governance structures, into the ethics, policies, practices, auditing, financials, company transparency. And I mean, it really just continues to go deeper and deeper. I mean, disclosure is a huge thing within governance, right? Which is what we were talking about earlier. So a little bit more, how do we add in transparency into the way that we're functioning within the supply chain, which is one of the ones where I think that blockchain is coming in really, really cool with some cool technologies around transparency and tracking things like, for example, Polestar, which I believe I think Volvo owns them, but they're like Volvo's EV brand, EV company, and they've been able to track some rare earth metals using some blockchain solution all the way back to make sure that it's not coming from a war-torn area in Africa, for example. So things like this, like where systemically, or we can say governmentally or through governance structures, where are we setting the gradient of the way that our company's trajectory wants to follow? So for me, the key here is beyond setting these mission and visions and values, which are concepts until they're integrated, the key is to actually integrate these concepts into step-by-step action. And I think that that's where the S and the G come in. And I think that, I mean, this is where Pueo lives, right? Like Pueo is essentially an agent of integration that helps organizations step into the truth of what they actually want to create and live in the world through their concepts that their company derives value from. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. I would say the G aspect is something I'm least familiar with, other than maybe the transparency aspect. I think that's, to me, you brought it up, blockchain. I think we'll play a role in that. I'm very keen on, generally speaking, the principles of having everything kind of transparent, because, you know, obviously you mentioned earlier in the podcast that it can be scary, but I think it's obviously rooted in the fact that there's been, you know, as you said, business has been done behind closed doors, and many kind of sideways business deals have been done. So there's going to be a lot of uncovering. But I think the only way to truly find the best ways to do things is through that transparency, right? I think of countless examples, even on just the people I've spoken on this show, where solutions were created only because there was, you know, data on what was actually happening, right? They only knew that there was waste in this area or that area because of the data that was shared. And even better solutions have come to be, right? In many instances too, the climate conscious way, if you will call it, or at least the socially responsible way of doing business actually is more profitable, right? So I think that honesty is something that's always been important to me in my career. So I think that's an interesting aspect. There's a lot of questions around this. I think maybe one of the big ones that I'd really like to kind of have you take a stab at, it's a pretty tough one, I feel, is how how can we, and we talked about how can we, actually ensure that people are being kind of restraining themselves a bit in how much they try to take. But I'm always curious about this idea behind incentives and how, especially in the venture capital world, companies are driven to just make as much profit as possible, right? So do you have, I guess, maybe predictions or thoughts on how the future of venture capital and investment will go as we kind of go deeper into this ESG aspect and start to realize the second and third order consequences of simply taking and just aiming for simply as much profits as possible?
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful question, and two things come to mind. The first one is our definition of capital, which I think goes into the kind of philosophy of capitalism, right? Like right now we have a specific definition of what capital is. Therefore, what we view as the value created and the allocated energy of businesses through monetary wealth versus other things that are going to come to be more of value as we start to understand that the business's long-term health cannot strictly be tied to monetary value creation. So the first one that comes to mind is that I think with the shifting global environment and a lot of other things that are happening, we're going to start to expand our definition of what capital means. I think it's going to incorporate conservation. I think it's going to incorporate human health and well-being. I think it's going to incorporate a lot of different shifting tides. So I think the definition of capital is going to expand because right now, what we view as profit is pretty myopic traditionally. The second thing, I almost lost this one. Let me find this. I mean, the second thing that came was regarding time. So if you're on a board of advisors or a board of directors, your purpose, from my understanding, is to ensure the extended longevity and life of the business. So the way that what's kind of happening now is this is going to be a funny image, but let's say that we have this massive bountiful garden and we're unable to satiate ourselves with a specific threshold of the amount that we're taking from the garden, yet we continue to procreate, and now there's a lot more people who we have to feed. Basically, we're coming to a really important tipping point where the actual resources in the garden is starting to get pretty slim, at least from the actual natural environment state, which ultimately even all of our digital creations, including these massive warehouses that have web hosting services like there are in Texas, like if they're affected by a natural disaster, like the entire southeast part of the United States like goes down from internet. So even within our technological creations, we have to be, and we are reliant upon the natural environment for this. And as we continue to hoard without threshold, we are kind of ensuring that all of the children on our planet are not going to really have enough to eat. So as we continue to kind of stuff our bellies, there's going to be impoverished and this is a metaphor, there's going to be impoverished and children who are emaciated looking for nourishment, but unfortunately the garden is going to be bereft of any food. So I think that in order to alter the way that we have to look at profit, we have to alter the way that we look at capital, and we have to alter the way that we look at time. Because if you're condensing all of your profit into these kind of VC models, which is like invest in like 3 to 5 years, like looking for this massive exit, versus building companies for people that you're never going to see. And this is kind of the ways that I've begun to look at my work is, and this falls directly in line with the 7th generation understanding of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederation, is how do you begin to build out your processes and the way that you create for 7 generations ahead. And to do that, planting a tree is a really easy example, right? Like whenever I'm on the island, the big island of Hawaii, and I find avocados on the side of the road because there's just avocado trees everywhere, I'm like, wow, whoever planted this tree is probably no longer alive, because this tree is like 60, 70 years old, bearing fruit. And so within them planting that tree, they've made sure that I today, a person they've never met and they couldn't have even dreamed of, is being nourished. So within that, I mean, I think that's the true definition of profitability, is to move into a space where we are able to create in such a capacity that it fulfills different definitions of profit and capital, and it also extends that into the future for people that we're never going to meet.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite interesting. This is actually something I've really been trying to think about a lot, is, when thinking about building any organization or company or anything, right? I intend to build something in the future. It's how big should something be, and how quickly should you aim to grow something, right? And how much should it be about you rather than the future? And I think that that's a really interesting observation that I feel is actually just recently heard about this idea that kind of, to Americans, a few hundred years seems like quite a long time, right? But for example, you might speak this more because you have experience with it. To somebody from China, 100 years is a very short amount of time in their kind of span of a kingdom, right? In various sorts, right? And yep. Being able to look at things from more of a delayed gratification perspective, rather than just simply, hey, what can we get now, right here and now, and how can I get it fast? Which is, inherently maybe not just American, but it happens to be an American trait, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I mean, Amazon operates with, like, I can somehow get, like, if I needed toothpaste right now, maybe not right now because I'm in Mazunte in Oaxaca, but like traditionally when I'm in Texas, if I need toothpaste, I can just have it dropped on my door within like 24 hours, right? Like, we've gotten so used to this instant gratification paradigm, which is not inherent in nature, because if you go out and you plant a seed, a tree does not fruit for you in a month, right? Like, so basically, like what you're saying, our perception of time and the linearity of time really being pulled out of the cyclicality or non-linearity, the seasonal aspects of how time functions. The commoditization of time through the linearity of it has really kind of thrown us for a loop, because we kind of expect things, and we see people like making a bunch of money with like these like companies like Snapchat when they're like 26, and like all of a sudden there's like a level of entitlement tied into the linearity of time, and like there's this entire value system that's trying to extract as much as possible in specific ways within the structure of time, that kind of confuses us from the depth and the longevity of even thinking about something like the Earth has been here for 4.3 billion years. It's like that number is unfathomable. Yet when you think about the scale and the blink of time that human beings have been here versus the damage that we've been able to create within that time, it's a sobering thought to be able to pull yourself out of your own vision of time and enter into an expanded state of self.
Yeah, I think this is obviously, I love philosophical questions. I think it'd be interesting to talk more about that. I would like to, maybe on the same topic of time, shift a little bit to something that I've been wondering about, being in talent acquisition as my day job. What do you see as trends, or maybe kind of just thoughts on how employers who are actually conscious of ESG and implementing it are treating their employees with, again, this goes back to the same idea of also trying to extract as much value as possible, with shifting to a model where it's okay to take more time off. Maybe there's not a traditional 40-hour work week where, and this is something I don't think I've talked about ever in the podcast, where if employees have more time for themselves, they could spend more time understanding themselves and working on their mental health, and perhaps the second and third order effects that might produce for just America as a whole. Like, do you have any examples or thoughts kind of just on this in general and what companies are doing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any companies off the top of my head to kind of whip out statistics or any of the structure or policies that they have, but I think that companies are moving in the direction of understanding that their employees are the most valuable, or one of the most valuable assets to their entire functioning organization. So how can they actually be set up in a way for a multi-dimensional avenue of success? So that could be physically, so avoiding burnout or learning ways to not burn out in the first place, as opposed to like retroactively trying to heal it. There's mental and emotional states. So like how do employees actually begin to function in the unknown and uncertainty, which is what we're kind of continuously thrust within. And I mean, it's one of the principles of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism is essentially impermanence, or anicca is the only truth, right? But I think part of our linearity of time is planning and trying to extrapolate out like what's our 5, 10, 15-year plan, when every single moment is impermanent. So I think that with businesses beginning to, at least the more conscious businesses or the more aware businesses beginning to move in this direction, I think it's going to bring up a lot of really cool and interesting opportunities for innovation, utilizing kind of hybrid models or intersectional models of understanding time and understanding benefit and understanding value and understanding utility, and letting employees potentially even designate their own career tracks or ways that they can plug into the business in itself. And I think that this is for me what the definition of harmony means. So a lot of times I mention the word harmony, and harmony is a musical term that refers to the way that an orchestra can function fluidly and serendipitously, yet there are potentially 15 different instruments all playing their own notes. So with all of us being unique individuals, how do we function within some sort of orchestral harmony where our own creativity can function and align with the purpose of the business simultaneously to create that beautiful piece of music? So some people might be able to bump out 80-hour work weeks. Some people might need to have a 30-hour work week. And I mean, ultimately, for me specifically, I've noticed that I have really intense focus. So if I really I've always been able to, even when I worked at different companies, I've been able to complete what some people may need 10 hours to do. I've been able to complete it in 2 hours. So I think that a lot of this standardization, which we also see in the educational system, right? Like this standardized educational system is being debunked. I think most standardization, this like blanketed cog sort of mentality, is being debunked as we move deeper into, at least in biomimicry, we can see that each like microclimate or ecosystem has a lot of different biodiversities, and they're not all created equal. Like a frog does not live the same amount of time as a jaguar, does not live the same amount of time as a tree, does not function in the same way as the rain. So it's like, how can we begin to really look at this biodiversity within our own organizations and allow that ecosystem to flourish? So I think that there's a lot of really cool ways to do it. And it's part of what we do with Pueo, is help organizations create this, or just remember it really, you know, because a lot of what we're doing, we think that what we're doing is creating, but what we're actually doing is just revealing what has already been there for a very, very long time. And remembering that it's truly of value, and that we can learn a lot from our environment, which we think is separate from ourselves, when it really is just a part of ourselves, made up of the same elements in the periodic table, and certain elements have certain behaviors. And how do we allow these behaviors to function in the way that they're functioning in accordance with harmony? So remembering these things and building out company processes and organizational maps and strategies is kind of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions I'd like to go to. I think maybe to close things off, one of my favorite things to talk about, which you've already recently just touched on, is education. So would you, you can take this from whatever angle you prefer, but I'd be keen to understand if you have any thoughts on how maybe universities or educational institutions might approach becoming ESG aligned, or perhaps if you just see, you know, you want to talk about what you think the future of education might be as regards to helping people understand what ESG is. Maybe it's the role of companies to continually educate their employees. Whatever you want to talk about. I'm just kind of keen to hear your thoughts, more broadly on the space.
Yeah, there's a couple different directions that I think it can go. One of them is a phrase that came to me maybe, I don't know, a few months ago, where it's knowledge is more, wisdom is less. And I think that our education system is really jam-packed with adding more knowledge, a lot more conceptual knowledge, and a lot less integrated experiential and embodied awareness. So I think that the education system is going to move in the direction of experience and integrating the concepts into aligned action, because a lot of Western philosophy is very mind worshiping the intellect driven. And a lot of native philosophy is there's no thought, it's just the action itself. So the way that we're thinking and being educated is really on things that we could directly experience ourselves, as opposed to just thinking about them. And one of I forget where I read this. It was in a book or somewhere, but I think it said that, isn't it so strange that to learn about trees, we had to cut down the trees, turn them into paper, and then write about the tree, as opposed to going out and being able to just look at the tree and learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of what we're doing in our education system is kind of related to that, right? It's related to kind of thinking that we're taking shortcuts, but we're really kind of mangling the entire process a little bit. So I think that really what I'm seeing is this introduction from more conceptual understanding to integrated action. And then simultaneously, I think a lot of education, and one of the things that I provide to individuals as well as organizations is called the Regenerative Leadership Academy, which is an 8-week unschool. So the process itself is actually unlearning a lot of what we've actually learned, because a lot of what we've learned is not in harmony or synchronistic with natural processes. And it's creating a degenerative paradigm. And it's creating that within our own health, which we can see by the massive increases of diseases like obesity and anxiety and all of these things. It's creating it with our relationships. I mean, there's probably over a 50% or 49 to 51% divorce rate in the United States. Within our communities, our community fabrics and structures have completely eroded, and now we live in little boxes and are separated from one another, and our environment is being completely degraded and degenerated by our extractive models. So what we're doing is not working. So a lot of what we have to do through education is the uneducation, or as Lauryn Hill in her album, the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, right? But like, how do we actually take this unschool approach to unplug from the things that are short-circuiting our lives? So I think that education in itself is going to, at least from my point of view and where I feel me continuing to get my own education, it's a diversity of perspective. The perspective is then integrated into an action as opposed to a concept. And then we're unlearning a bunch of things that have not functioned in the first place, to then fill our cups with things that are actually going to allow our planet and species to continue to thrive, as opposed to what the Hopi said, is that this is the fourth time around for humans. The prior 3 got wiped out. So, I mean, we're obviously repeating the same cycle here, and we're not learning. So how do we actually learn? And I think we have to learn by unlearning. So yeah, I'll say about that for now.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting perspective. I mean, I'm not sure if we've talked about this before. I was homeschooled, and I had a very different upbringing than many people. So I think that, and I didn't go to university. So I think that some of these things I haven't experienced directly, but I've, obviously been product of many of these things, right? Because it's kind of embedded in the way we think and the way we do things. So it's quite an interesting take, I think. We're basically out of time here, but this has been a very enjoyable conversation, Ryan. Really, really enjoy your takes on these things and understanding kind of your perspective. It's a very interesting one. This has been a very good time. Definitely going to have you on again in the future, but thank you so much for joining. Is there any final items you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, thank you for having me as well. Yeah, I'll just leave it with where people could find me at. So basically, you can find me with my company, Pueo Regenerative Consulting, and that's at pueo.consulting. That's the website. I also have an Instagram at RyanJ_Kemp, Kemp, and my website is www.ryanjkemp.com. You can find a lot of my different work there. I also have 4 published books on Amazon, 2 children's books on Mahayana Buddhism, 1 poetry book, and a full-length book called The Age of Separation. So if anyone wants to find me or get in contact with me, you can find me through there. I'm also on LinkedIn, and any one of those channels should function. So I appreciate you, Silas, for having this podcast, and I appreciate anyone who's listening or will listen in the future. And I hope that this can help to expand our perspectives and usher in a time and place where we're able to step deeper into responsibility and an interconnected awareness. So I appreciate it.
Certainly. Very, very glad to have you on and to be able to have your perspective on these things. And I really do hope that this, at least impacts, at least at the bare minimum, a couple people. So thank you so much, Ryan.
All right, we really hope you enjoyed the conversation today with Ryan. If you do want to continue hearing more conversations like this, please do subscribe and turn on the notifications so you can know when something new drops, because we don't necessarily have a standard schedule here. But please do stay tuned for the next episode in this ESG mini-series. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please, of course, rate and review. It really does help get our reach out. You can do the same thing on Spotify as well. And if you are looking to sponsor the show, we do encourage you to reach out. Share this episode with others who might find it interesting. Maybe people are skeptical about ESG in general. You can also join our Slack channel in the link in the description. And then, of course, follow our LinkedIn page to get newsletter bites each week and then a monthly recap at the end of every 4 weeks. Of course, we also recommend reaching out to connect with Ryan. He's really great and has so many resources on the ESG space, so I really recommend that as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping me on Twitter. So a quick note on our next episode. Our next episode will be with Sandra Toski, who is an expert in the ESG software space. It's really, really interesting and fun conversation discussing kind of the future breakdown of the ESG software space and different players and how things might play out. So it's really, really interesting discussion. I enjoyed it quite a lot. But as always, thank you so much for listening to Clean Tech is the podcast, and we will see you next time.